Hi, I'm Kathy from Eclectic Images and welcome to Crafting with Kathy. Today we're doing a glossy scene, a scene on glossy card, which creates a really nice postcard sort of effect. So we're using some of our Australiana stamps. We're not looking for, I've done with old world looking colours. Rather than being realistic colours, I've done an old world, not quite sepia look, but heading on those sort of lines, greens and greys. So it creates quite a masculine card, which can be a little bit difficult to make sometimes. So here's our card that we're going to create. So it's using stamps in different ways to what we're used to as well. So we're actually using parts of the stamp instead of the whole stamp. So the stamps that we're actually using today are all from the Eclectic Images range. We've got our Windmills, and we're using the larger one out of that set. We've got Aussie Creek, which we'll just be using parts of. We've got Gum Tree Silhouette, and we'll use the larger tree out of that one. And Gum Leaf Branch, which is great for silhouettes. Our ink pads today are all from the Catherine Pooler range, working with a couple of colours from the Spa collection, Sage and Eucalyptus. We've got a couple from the neutrals, Twilight and Blackjack, and Midnight for all of our basic images. Now, you can use either acrylic blocks or a stamping platform or a MISTI for doing your basic stamping. I find on gloss card, because it is slippery, that sometimes using a platform does make life a lot easier. So I've already lined my card up here. I'm just going to work out where I would like my windmill to be. And we pick that up, ink it up with our black. Now you will find, again, because glossy card, the polymer stamps tend to stick to it, that you might need to just line it up again, which is why I've pushed this into the corner so I know exactly where it was to be able to line that up again. Now I'll grab my Midnight ink pad. Remember, with your Catherine Pooler inks, just a very light tap is plenty. Good press over the stamp and then lift up. Now quite often it will stick and the card will move even with the magnets in place. That's fine. You just need to you can then line it up back with the corner where you were before. Pop that off and pop our next stamp on, which is going to be our Aussie Creek, which is a complete scene, but what we're going to do is just use part of it. Now I've actually, because this stamp has recently been cleaned, the polymer's quite sticky, even though it's stained and black. That's because it gets used with archival inks all the time. And certainly your clear stamp staining doesn't affect the quality of how the stamp stamps. It's just that the polymer does stain when you're using the archival inks. But what I'm going to do is actually just, while I'm lining it up, I'm just going to dust it over with my anti-static pad so it doesn't stick too much to the card while I'm getting myself worked out. So let's pop our card into place and pop our magnets on. And then I'm just going to maneuver this until the lines on it just disappear into the windmill. Then we can pick it up on our platform. And even then it's still sticking to the card a bit, but not as much as it would like to. So we'll reposition our card into our platform. I'm going to give that a bit of a wipe off and to wipe that anti-static powder off, and then we can ink it up. Gentle taps. And then I'm actually going to use a bit of paper towel just to take away some of this colour. I don't want such a solid edge at the bottom, so I'm just going to use a bit of paper towel to dab in there and lift a bit of colour off. Press down, and it's quite likely to grip the card. That's okay. So you can see now that we've actually faded it off at the bottom there. Now to use the rest of the stamp, I'm going to need to give this a really good clean. Now I'm actually going to tip my card around because I'm only using just the end of the stamp and it's a big stamp. If I don't tip it this way, it's going to overlap the edge of the platform to where there's a ridge on the platform. So I'm going to place my card at a very odd angle. Pop our magnets in place. We're going to dust this stamp off with the anti-static pad again. And now work out where it's going to go. So I want those lines almost meeting up with the previous lines that we put in. So from the other half. So it neatly fits in the edges of the platform there. Now let's take off that powder, ink her up, and we'll be ready to go. Feels very strange stamping on an angle like this. Beautiful. Now the last thing I'm going to do is stamp the words Aussie Dream down the bottom. And they actually come in, I think it's the Aussie Dream. I think that's in, not the Aussie Creek set, it's in the Aussie Country Road set, has the words Aussie Dream in them. With the Australiana ones, the Outback Rocks, the Aussie Creek and the Aussie Road, I've done the fonts, the words all in the same font, which means if you have the different sets, you can actually interchange the words. And we have the word Australia just as a stamp on its own, also in the same font. So by using your platform, it means you can line those words up exactly where you want them. Again, we'll just reposition our bit of card. Our scrap paper, pop our magnets on to hold it in place. Grab our beautiful black ink. Little tap across. And then stamp. It certainly takes, using something like a MISTI or a platform, does take some of the fear out of stamping on gloss card. Because it's a slippery surface, it can be quite difficult to stamp onto without your stamps slipping. Right here, we'll take those stamps out of there and put this to one side for now. Now we need to get that black ink really dry. It does need to be heat set, well it's better if you heat set on the gloss card. And we want it really dry before we start doing any colouring, otherwise it's going to smudge. So let's get our heat gun out and start drying. And making lots of noise. So it's interesting the effects you can get with your stamps when you look at them in a little bit of a different way and actually use part of the stamp instead of using the whole stamp. The Aussie Country Road is another one like that, where you can use just the top half of it and create a low horizon that works really nicely for some of your sunset scenes. Now I've put a lot of ink on there, so it's going to take me a few minutes to get it dry. So I'm just watching for when the ink stops looking quite so shiny. And then I usually just test it somewhere where I know I'm going to stamp over the top, so it's going to be inconspicuous. Just test a little bit and just give it a wipe with my finger. Make sure there's no smudging happening. We're all good. So now we can start our colouring. I'm going to start with the Sage ink. And I'm also going to start using a blending brush. So your blending brush means I can cover quite a large area very easily. And then we're going to switch to our future brushes, which concentrate the colour more and means we can place the colour more where we want it. But let's just get a bit of colour on to start with. Okay, ink it up, start off on your scrap and then shade onto the card. You'll find on the gloss card that your ink blends on quite easily. Now I'm going to be leaving a glowing area where we imagine there's sunlight coming from in the sky, so I want to leave a corresponding area where that light is hitting the tops of our hills. So I'm not wanting to take this colour over the whole background image. I hope that made sense. It made sense in my head. Sometimes that doesn't translate to what's making sense to you when you're watching. Please remember, you can always put comments after the the clips, and I will get back to you and answer those queries. So if I've done something where you're really not sure what I've done or why, just drop me a line. So I'm starting at the edge of the card and then shading in so that there's less ink on the brush as we get into where we're wanting to create that lovely glow. I'm just going to come around where our glow's here, and I've left a bit light there, so I'm just going to shade a bit of our sage colour over that. You do need to be a little bit careful with your gloss card too. Once you start getting some ink onto it, you want to be careful how you're handling it, because you don't want your fingers to actually smudge the ink off. So you'll notice quite often that I'm not holding the card with my fingers, I'm holding it with the flat of my hand, or I'll actually have a bit of scrap paper, a mask or a bit of paper towel, and use that to hang onto the card so that I'm not putting fingerprints onto it. All right, now we move into the Eucalyptus ink and my number 10 brush. And we'll keep going with circles. So I want to work a fair way into the card, but not completely cover where I did the lovely soft sage. So we're starting off at the edge and then working the brush in. I'll go a little bit more gently over the top there, just because I don't want to come down into that glow too much. Now as I get to the other edge, I can put a bit more ink on. And because we've already got the sage ink covering there, we can go directly onto the card with our eucalyptus and it's not going to grab. It isn't a bad habit though, when you can, to work from the edge in, but you will find that once you've got a bit of ink happening, you've got that slip factor. Now we could leave it just in the green tones, that would be fine, but I'm wanting to antique this one a bit more, so I'm going to add some grey over the top of that. So we'll grab Twilight. And we're just going to dull it down a bit. Sounds horrid to it, doesn't it? And you can see, if you have a look at it now, how that grey is just taking some of the green tone, just toning it back a bit. Oh, I've got real flare there, sorry. You can see the difference between this part that's just the green and this bit where we've added the greys into it. So let's keep going around with our grey. I've gone with greys for this, but I actually would like to try this colour combination with the sage and the eucalyptus, and then adding one of the brown tones, possibly over coffee, into it as well, and creating more of a sepia tone. I think that would work really well as well. Okay, we're now going to finish our greying. I'll keep using the same brush. We're just going to add some blackjack, and this time we're going to pounce it around our edges. So we've been doing the circles, now we're switching to the pouncing. So the pouncing, we always just ink the very end of the brush. Pouncing is where you stipple it onto the card, but you let the bristles of the brush bend a little bit, and that actually helps to do the blending for you. It's something where you need to find an angle that suits you to work at. I find I always work better almost diagonally across from myself. It's no good pouncing and getting round to the edge of the card and stomping this way, because you'll end up just putting blobs of ink on the card. You've got to be facing so that the brush is going almost off the edge of the card, and it's the bristles of the brush that are going onto the card. So don't ever have your pouncing with your brush facing that way. It's got to be facing off the card. So to me, this is a really awkward angle to get round to. So I will move my card so that I always stay working at what's a nice, comfortable angle for me. And it looks really nice just to deepen this outer edge off. Don't try and do too much in one go. We just want to have chance to soften it all out before we move on to the next bit. You do have some blending time with these inks. That's the beauty of them with how well they work on the gloss, that they don't dry straight away, so you've got time to blend them out. But it's not forever. If you actually work around too big an area and then come back to do your blending, this area will have dried and you won't be able to soften the inks out. So do work on only a third or a half of the card at a time while you're doing this sort of a technique. So again, starting off right at the edge of the card, and then as I've got less ink on the brush, that's when I start to allow it to come in. Now if I find it's coming in too much, that's where I'd quickly grab my green brush and just either circles or patting it, just buff that colour back out a bit. It does take a little bit of patience, but the results are always worth it. Gloss card is a wonderful medium to work on. Now I've got a little bit much there, so I'm just going to just buff that back a little bit. So I've got to be careful along the top there because I haven't got a lot of area before you get to the glow, and I don't want to lose my nice light glow. Bit down this side, and we're nearly finished with our shading. Bit of buffing there, not quite happy. But overall, very happy. So now to do our next bit, we need this really, really dry, because my next stage is to actually emboss some silhouette images over the top. You don't have to do that. This is a lovely card as it is and can be mounted up on a base card and would look gorgeous just like that. But I do find that if I add the extra embossing to it, it just creates this window that you're looking through. And yeah, it just gives the scene more dimension. So let's get our heat gun and just give it a really good dry. If I was to start doing my embossing now, my embossing ink is going to stick to most of this card. And I want it to go just where I put the next layer of stamps. With my heat gun techniques, when I'm actually embossing, you'll notice I hold the heat gun fairly steady, but when I'm drying, I get a fair bit of air movement happening as well. The other thing I'm going to make sure that I do is wipe over this with the anti-static pad before we start doing our embossing. This will also help to make sure that those inks are really dry. So I'm going to use the larger tree out of the gum tree silhouettes, and we'll use it with our Versamark ink, which is my favourite for embossing with. And I've got my black embossing powder standing ready. What I'm going to do with the tree though is what I want to create is just some low bushes around the lower edge of the card. So what I'm going to be doing is just using the edges of the tree to create this bush effect. So sometimes it's good to look at your stamps in a different way. What can we do with them that's getting more use out of them and making them look a little bit different? So I'm trying to use just those wispy bits at the edge, but I know I want to get lots of embossing along the bottom edge of the card too. So I'm going to add some extra bits in there to make sure I fill it out. Okay, let's put our embossing powder on and see how we went. It's always a bit funny because you're never quite sure where you're stamping when you're doing that. So I'm just tipping the black embossing powder on. I find that I have my black embossing powder in a container like this because I use it so often. Big dump on the back. Now I'm just going to check whether I've got embossing powder where I don't want it, and we've done pretty well. We must have got that background pretty dry. There's a few bits there that will just clear off. Okay, let's give that a heat. Making sure that I point my heat gun away from my embossing powder. So it's a different look to the normal grasses or flowery borders that I often do. And it's just something to make you think about your stamps in a different way. Okay, we're now going to add the gum leaf branch around the top edge, and this we'll use in a more standard way. So ink it up with our Versamark. Now the Versamark pad I have re-inked recently. It's something that, this one and my Catherine Pooler Black are the ink pads that I have to re-ink most often. Possibly because I use them so much, but also they perform better when they're very juicy. A little bit just down the side there. Now I am watching where my bottom area is because you don't want to try and emboss over where you've already embossed. It loses the silhouette effect. I'm just going to pop that over on the side a bit so I make sure I get right to the end of those gum leaves. Let's get our little brush and tap down the side. Good thump on the back. And we did again get a little bit of extra embossing powder where we don't want it. So I'm just coming in with the fine brush just to push that away. When you're doing a card like this at home, you're able to leave your card sit and wait for those background colours to really dry before you do the embossing. It's a little bit more tricky when I'm doing demonstrating, that I need to keep moving with a card. So yeah, it's always good just to give that background a little bit of time to dry. Okay, we can pop our embossing powder to one side now and bring the heat gun in. Love watching that change. This is the working with the Ranger Black embossing powder, and it's just got a really good shine to it. You will find with a stamp like the gum leaves, it's such a solid image that sometimes you do get a few gaps where you might not have inked completely. Don't worry about that, because when you look at actual gum leaves, they have gaps and holes in them, so it actually makes it look a little bit more realistic. So let's move forward. There's our card sample. Just ready to be mounted up. Probably I'd mount that up on some black card. But I'm loving those colours, that it's muted, it's earthy. As I said, would make a very good masculine card. You'll see with the sample that I did initially that there was, with using the gum leaf branch, there was a few gaps here where my bushes didn't go right to the bottom of the card, which is why on this one I used the top of the tree that's more solid just to fill that bottom bit in a little bit more. So part of that, getting the best out of that stamp, is practice, just to see how it works and how you can break it down just to use parts of it. So quite a lovely scene, not realistic tones, but it works well anyway. As I said, we'll have a go with this one with the sepia tones as well another time. So join us then. But anyway, thank you for being with us today, and we'll be back soon with another clip. Maybe a glossy scene, maybe a blended scene. Okay, we'll see you soon. Thank you.